On the night of January 14th, a 79-year-old woman was handed a black garbage bag. Inside it, a bottle of blood pressure medication, a second bottle of metformin, one wool coat with a missing button, and a framed photograph of a man who had been dead for 3 years. That was everything they gave her. That was everything they thought she was worth. The temperature outside was 11 degrees. There was no car waiting, no neighbor who had been called. The porch light went off behind her before she reached the end of the driveway. She stood at the edge of Route 9 in Harlan County with snow beginning to fall and nowhere, not a single place on earth to go. She had lived in that house for 41 years. She had painted every room in it. She had buried a husband from it. She had raised a son inside those walls who, on this particular night, watched her from the upstairs window and did not come down. They believed she had nothing. They believed they had taken everything. What they forgot was 2 miles up the mountain, sitting quiet in the dark, exactly where Harold had left it, and it had been waiting for her for 66 years. This is Margaret's story. Margaret Elaine Voorhees turned 79 on the 3rd of October, in the same house where she had celebrated every birthday since 1983. She did not make a fuss about it. She never had. She baked her own cake, a buttermilk pound cake with lemon glaze, Harold's recipe, the one she had written on an index card in 1971 and never once needed to look at again. She set 2 plates on the table out of habit. She caught herself doing it. She put 1 plate back. That had been happening for 3 years now. The house on Clement Road was a white 2-story colonial with green shutters and a wraparound porch that Harold had reinforced twice, once in 1988, once in 2004, both times because Margaret had told him the boards were soft and he had waited until she was right. The kitchen faced east and got the morning light first, which was why Margaret had always done her serious thinking there. By 6:15 every morning, she was already at the table with a cup of black coffee and whatever problem she had decided to solve that day. She was not a woman who left problems sitting. For 41 years, she had kept the household accounts in a green ledger book, columns for utilities, groceries, property tax, medical, repairs. Harold had tried once, early in their marriage, to move everything to a bank-issued register. Margaret had thanked him and continued using the green ledger. When he died, the ledger showed every dollar that had entered and left that house since April of 1982. Her handwriting had not changed once. Her son Daniel was 53. He lived 20 minutes away in a newer development called Whispering Pines, which had no pines and did very little whispering. He had his father's jawline and his father's stubbornness and none of his father's patience. He called on Sundays, usually between the football games, usually for less than 8 minutes. Margaret had never timed the calls deliberately. She knew anyway. Daniel's wife was Renee. Renee had opinions about the house. She had begun mentioning them the previous spring, casually at first, the way someone tests ice before stepping onto it fully. The house was too large for one person. The upkeep was considerable. There were communities, very nice ones, designed specifically for someone at Margaret's stage of life. The word stage was doing a great deal of work in those conversations, and Margaret noticed it every time. She did not say anything. She wrote the grocery list for the week and let Renee's voice move around the kitchen like weather. What Margaret did not tell anyone, what she had told no one since Harold passed, was that she had begun waking at 3 a.m. and going downstairs to sit in the dark. Not from sadness, exactly. From something she could not name. A feeling that the house was holding its breath. that something was moving in the edges of things, just outside where she could see it. She would sit at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the surface, the way Harold used to do when he was thinking through something serious, and she would wait for the feeling to pass. It always did. By morning, the kitchen was just a kitchen again. The light came through the east window. The coffee was hot. The green ledger was on the shelf exactly where it belonged. She was fine. Everything was fine. She told herself this on the morning of January 9th, 5 days before they put her out in the snow. She almost believed it. The papers arrived on the morning of January 10th, not slid under the door, not left on the porch. Hand-delivered by Daniel himself, who rang the bell at 8:45 in the morning, while Margaret was still in her housecoat, still holding her first cup of coffee. He was wearing his good coat. Renee was in the car at the end of the driveway, engine running, not looking at the house. Margaret noticed the coat. Daniel only wore it for occasions he had decided in advance were important. He did not come inside. He held out a manila envelope and said that he and Renee had spoken with an attorney and that some decisions had been made regarding the estate and the property and that it would be better for everyone. He used the phrase better for everyone twice if Margaret reviewed the documents and signed where indicated. Margaret set her coffee cup on the porch railing. She took the envelope. She opened it standing in the doorway in her housecoat while her son watched from the top step with his hands in his coat pockets. Inside was a 6-page legal document from an attorney's office in Harrisburg. The language was dense and formatted to feel inevitable, the kind of document designed to make a person believe the decisions inside it had already been finalized, and that signing was merely a formality. Margaret read the first 2 pages without expression. Then she read them again. The document proposed the transfer of the property at Clement Road into a joint trust managed by Daniel and Renee. Margaret would retain residency rights. The phrase used was lifetime occupancy consideration, subject to quarterly review. There was a clause on page 4 that defined the conditions under which the occupancy consideration could be terminated. Margaret read that clause 3 times. She looked up at her son. She asked him when he had retained this attorney. Daniel said November. She asked him why he had not told her in November. He said the attorney had advised waiting until the documentation was complete. Margaret picked up her coffee cup from the porch railing. She went back inside. She closed the door. What followed were 4 days that Margaret would never fully describe to anyone, though the green ledger from that week showed entries that told their own story. Calls to 2 attorneys, one in Harrisburg, one in Carlisle. A notation on January 11th, consultation fee of $75, Greenwald office, no favorable outcome likely without extended litigation. Another on January 12th called legal aid, wait list 6-8 weeks. A third entry, January 13th, in handwriting slightly less steady than usual, options narrowing. The Harrisburg attorney had been direct with her. The document Daniel presented was aggressive, but not necessarily illegal. Harold's estate had passed through probate 3 years prior, with Daniel listed as primary heir. The house was marital property. Margaret's occupancy rights were real but contestable. Fighting it would cost between $18,000 and $25,000 and take 14 to 22 months. The attorney had said this with the particular tone of a person explaining something to someone they do not expect to take action. Margaret had thanked him and paid the $175 consultation fee in cash from the envelope she kept in the kitchen drawer. On the evening of January 13th, Daniel and Renee came to the house together. Renee did the talking this time. She explained, sitting at Margaret's kitchen table in Margaret's kitchen, in the house Margaret had lived in for 41 years. that they had given her time to review the documents and that the situation was not going to improve by waiting, and that there was a very nice place in Mechanicsburg, a senior living facility which had an opening and which Daniel had already placed a deposit on, and that it would be better for everyone. Margaret asked one question. She asked whether Harold had known about any of this. The question landed in the kitchen and sat there. Renee looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at the table. Neither of them answered. Margaret stood up. She went to the kitchen counter and began washing the 3 cups she had set out when they arrived. She washed them slowly, thoroughly, the way she washed everything. She dried them with the dish towel that had hung on the oven handle for 15 years. She put them back in the cabinet. She said she would need until the morning to gather her things. They did not wait until morning. At 9:47 p.m. on January 14th, Renee knocked on Margaret's bedroom door and said the car was outside and that it was better to do this tonight. Daniel was in the hallway. He did not look at his mother directly. He looked at a point just past her left shoulder, the way a person looks when they have decided something and do not want the other person's face to change the decision. Margaret carried her own bag downstairs. Nobody helped her. The garbage bag was Renee's addition, a last-minute practical gesture, she said, for the overflow items. Margaret put the photograph of Harold inside it herself. She put the medications in herself. She picked up the wool coat from the hook by the door and put it on herself, the one with the missing button she had been meaning to replace since November. She walked out the front door. The porch light went off at the end of the driveway. She walked north on Route 9 because north was uphill and uphill meant away. The snow had started an hour earlier, not the gentle kind, but the flat, sideways kind that gets into everything. Margaret walked with the garbage bag over one shoulder and the photograph pressed against her chest inside her coat. Her blood pressure medication was in the bag. She had taken her evening dose at 7. She would need the morning dose in approximately 9 hours. She walked for 40 minutes before she saw it. The cabin sat 40 feet back from the fire road, barely visible through the tree line, a structure her feet had apparently remembered, even if her mind had been elsewhere. Harold's cabin, the one he had driven up to 3 or 4 times a year for fishing and quiet and whatever it was men needed from a place with no telephone. She had not been there in over a decade, maybe longer. The lock on the door had frozen solid. Margaret stood on the porch of the cabin in 11-degree weather and looked at the lock for a long moment. Then she walked to the woodpile at the side of the cabin. Harold had always kept one, and someone, apparently, still did, picked up a length of split oak, roughly the weight of a good argument, and hit the lock mechanism 4 times until the housing cracked and the door swung open. She went inside. The cabin was one large room with a stone fireplace, a cot frame with no mattress, a small kitchen shelf, and a back room she had always assumed held fishing equipment. The cold inside was the same as the cold outside, minus the wind. She found a box of fireplace matches on the mantel. Harold had stored matches in the same place in every building he had ever occupied, and she found enough dry wood stacked beside the hearth to start a fire that would last 3 hours if she was careful. She needed something to burn first, something to catch. She went to the back room. It was smaller than she remembered. A narrow shelf along one wall held rusted tackle boxes and folded canvas. On the floor, pushed against the back wall, was a cedar chest. Dark wood, brass fittings, the kind Harold had bought at an estate sale sometime in the 1970s. She had forgotten it existed. She dragged it out by its handles. She tried the latch. Locked. She went back to the fireplace, picked up the poker, and forced the latch on the second strike. Inside, a folded wool blanket, a canvas fishing vest, 2 paperback books warped by old moisture, and a water-damaged copy of the Farmer's Almanac 1962 with a rubber band around it that disintegrated when she touched it. She picked up the almanac to set it aside. Something fell out from between its pages and landed face up on the floorboards. A single folded sheet of paper, typed, the kind of typing that came from a machine that struck the page hard enough to feel. The paper was the color of old cream. The fold lines were deep and permanent. She picked it up. She read the first line. Then she read it again. Warranty deed. Harlan County Recorder of Deeds. Grantor, Thomas W. Burkett. Grantee, Margaret Elaine Voorhees, sole A&D, separate property. Date of conveyance, August 17th, 1958. Margaret Elaine Voorhees, not Harold. Not Harold and Margaret, not the Voorhees Family Trust. Her name only. 6 months before the wedding, she sat down on the frozen floorboards of the cabin with the deed in both hands. The fire had not been lit yet. The cold was everywhere. Outside, the blizzard pressed against the one small window like something that had been trying to get in for a long time. She sat there for a long time. They had thrown her out of the house on Clement Road, the house that Harold's estate had controlled, the house that Daniel's attorney had restructured and claimed and prepared to sell. They had put her in a garbage bag and walked her to the end of a driveway. And in doing so, without knowing it, without checking, without once walking to the back room of a cabin they had dismissed as worthless, they had walked her directly to the one thing that was entirely, legally, and irrevocably hers. She had never been homeless. She owned 4.2 acres and every board of a cabin that Harold Voorhees had built with his own hands in 1961, on land he had quietly, carefully, lovingly put in her name 3 years before she became his wife. Margaret folded the deed. She placed it inside her coat, against her chest, next to Harold's photograph. Then she got up off the floor, went to the hearth, and built the fire. She fed the fire until 4 a.m. The wool blanket from the cedar chest smelled of cedar and old seasons and something faintly like Harold's workshop, sawdust and linseed oil, and the particular quiet of a man who worked with his hands because thinking was easier when the hands were occupied. Margaret wrapped it around her shoulders and sat close enough to the fire that the left side of her face was warm while the right side stayed cold. She did not sleep. She did not try to. She thought instead. This was what Margaret Voorhees did when the situation was serious. She did not cry first and think later. She did not panic and recover. She sat with the problem the way she sat with the green ledger, column by column, line by line, until the shape of it was clear enough to act on. By 2 a.m, she had established the following. She was alive. She was not hypothermic. The fire would last until dawn if she added wood every 40 minutes, which she would do. She had her morning medication in the garbage bag. She had the deed. The deed had been filed with the Harlan County Recorder of Deeds in August of 1958, which meant it was a matter of public record, which meant it had existed in that office for 66 years without anyone in her family ever once thinking to look for it. Harold had never mentioned it. She understood, sitting in that firelight, why he hadn't. Harold Voorhees was not a man who gave gifts with explanations attached. He had put the land in her name before the wedding because he wanted her to have something that was hers before she became his. He had filed it properly, and then he had put the deed in the cedar chest, and he had never brought it up. because, in his understanding of love, a thing done quietly was done more completely than a thing announced. She pressed her hand flat against her coat, where the deed sat folded against her chest. "You extraordinary man," she thought. "You impossible, quiet, extraordinary man." At first light, she assessed the cabin properly for the first time. It was in worse condition than she had registered in the dark. The back wall had moisture damage along the lower 2 feet. Not structural, she thought, but significant. One of the 2 windows had a crack in the lower pane running diagonally from corner to center, taped on the outside with weather stripping that had long since lost its adhesion. The kitchen shelf held a single burner camp stove, a dented percolator, and a coffee can containing $17 in loose change, and 4 Susan B. Anthony dollars Harold had collected because he found the idea of a woman on currency quietly satisfying. The roof, as far as she could tell from inside, was intact. The fireplace drew cleanly. The floor was solid. It was not nothing. It was genuinely, structurally, not nothing. She made an inventory on the back of a grocery receipt she found in her coat pocket. She wrote in the margins and between the printed lines because she had not survived 80 years by wasting paper. Needs, window repair, wall moisture treatment, functional sleeping surface, insulation check, waterline inspection, electrical assessment. Has 4 walls, 1 working fireplace, 1 functioning roof, $17 and 4 Susan B. Anthony coins, 1 wool blanket, 1 deed to the property, and the considerable advantage of still being alive when the people who had tried to end her chapter believed otherwise. She underlined that last part, not for drama, for accuracy. She walked into Harlan proper at 9:15 that morning. 2 miles on a snow-cleared fire road in the wool coat with the missing button, the garbage bag over one shoulder, the deed zipped into the interior pocket Harold had sewn into all his field coats, and which Margaret had transferred 2 winters ago into her own. Her feet were in house slippers, she had not had time for boots, and by the time she reached the main road, her toes were numb in a way that required attention. The first building she entered was Pruitt's Hardware on Gallagher Street because it opened at 8 and because Warren Pruitt kept a space heater behind the counter that had been running continuously since sometime in the Reagan administration. Warren Pruitt was 71 years old. He had sold Harold Voorhees roofing nails, weather stripping, deck screws, and 40 years of miscellaneous hardware supplies. He looked at Margaret when she came through the door, at the slippers, at the garbage bag, at the coat with the missing button, and he did not ask a single question. He pointed at the chair beside the space heater. She sat down. He brought her a cup of coffee from the back room without being asked. He set it on the counter within her reach and went back to pricing a box of hex bolts as if nothing unusual had occurred. Margaret drank the coffee. She let her feet thaw for 11 minutes. Then she said, "Warren, I need to know the name of the best property attorney in Harlan County who is not already working for my son." Warren put down the hex bolts. He thought for a moment. He said, "Judith Crail, Carlisle office. She beat the county in an eminent domain case in 2019, and they haven't forgiven her since." Margaret asked if he had a telephone she could use. He slid the store phone across the counter. Judith Crail was 54 years old, 5 feet 2 inches tall, and had a voice on the telephone that suggested she had once made a circuit court judge cry, though she would neither confirm nor deny this if asked. She ran a two-person practice out of a converted Victorian on Merchant Street in Carlisle, herself and a paralegal named Dove, who handled research with the focused intensity of someone diffusing ordnance. She agreed to see Margaret that afternoon, not because of the nature of the case, which she had not yet heard, but because Warren Pruitt had personally called her back after Margaret finished the first call and said, in the particular tone Warren reserved for things that mattered, "Judith, this one is real." Warren drove Margaret to Carlisle himself. He closed the hardware store at noon on a Thursday, the first time he had closed midday in 11 years, and drove her in his 2009 Silverado without once asking for an explanation beyond what she had already offered. His wife Ruth had passed in 2019. Margaret had brought a buttermilk pound cake to the house 3 days after the funeral. Warren Pruitt was not a man who forgot a buttermilk pound cake. In Judith Crail's office, Margaret placed the deed, still in the Ziploc freezer bag that Judith's paralegal Dove had immediately produced upon seeing the document's aging condition on the desk between them. Judith read it once. She read it again. She picked up her reading glasses and read the filing information in the lower left corner, which referenced the Harlan County Recorder of Deeds, Book 14, page 223, August 17th, 1958. She set the document down. She looked at Margaret across the desk. She said, "Mrs. Voorhees, do you understand what this is?" Margaret said she believed she did. Judith said, "This deed was filed and recorded 6 years ago. It has never been contested, never been transferred, never been named in any subsequent document, including your husband's probate proceedings. In the eyes of Harlan County and the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, you have owned this property exclusively and without interruption for 66 years. Margaret said, "Yes, I worked that out last night." Judith looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "I'm going to need you to tell me everything." Margaret told her everything. It took 47 minutes. She did not cry. She spoke in the same voice she used when reading entries from the Green Ledger, precise, sequential, without editorializing. When she finished, Judith's paralegal Dove had filled 4 pages of a yellow legal pad and was already at his computer. Judith said, "Mrs. Voorhees, your son's attorney filed an estate asset declaration with Harlan County Probate Court last week. That declaration lists the cabin and its surrounding acreage as marital property, value negligible. That declaration is factually incorrect. Depending on intent, it may also be fraudulent." Margaret said, "What happens next?" Judith said, "We file a title claim with the county recorder tomorrow morning. We notify the probate court of the discrepancy, and then we watch your son's attorney explain to a judge why he submitted a declaration of assets that omits 66 years of recorded title history." She paused. "Mrs. Voorhees, where are you sleeping tonight?" Margaret said she had a cabin. The first week was the hardest in the particular way that first weeks always are, not because the work was impossible, but because the gap between what needed doing and what was currently possible was wide enough to see clearly and narrow enough to cross if you did not stop moving. Warren Pruitt drove her back to the cabin that evening with the back of the Silverado carrying a foam camp mattress, 2 wool blankets, a working camp stove burner, a 5-gallon water jug, a box of basic provisions, and a bag of cedar shims for the cracked window, a temporary measure until glass could be cut. He also brought a pair of his late wife Ruth's winter boots, size 7, which he had found in the closet that morning and which fit Margaret with 1 pair of heavy socks. He did not make a speech about this. He carried the items inside, set them where they needed to go, checked the fireplace flue, and said he would be back Thursday with lumber. Margaret said, "Warren, what do I owe you?" Warren said, "Ruth liked your pound cake better than mine. We'll call it square. The town of Harlan, population 2,400, is not a town that keeps secrets effectively." By the second morning, the general outline of Margaret Voorhees' situation had moved through the community via the hardware store, the diner on Gallagher, and the Presbyterian Church's Thursday prayer circle with the efficiency of a thing people had been waiting to have an opinion about. Opinions were mixed, which was generous. The majority of what circulated was not mixed at all, but was simply not the kind of thing people said directly to Daniel Voorhees when they saw him at the gas station. Some people said Margaret should have signed the documents. She was 79. What did she need a cabin for? It was February in Pennsylvania. Margaret heard about these opinions secondhand through Warren, who reported them with the neutral expression of a man taking inventory and making no judgments about the merchandise. She did not respond to them. She was too busy. Every morning she was up at 5:30. She had established a routine within 72 hours of arriving at the cabin because a routine was the architecture of forward motion, and Margaret Voorhees had understood this since she was 19 years old. Coffee on the camp stove. Medication at 6. Inspection walk of the property perimeter. 4.2 acres took approximately 35 minutes at a reasonable pace, and she used the time to think. Then, work. The moisture damage on the back wall, she addressed herself with a combination of plastic sheeting, cedar shims, and a tube of exterior caulk Warren had included in the second supply run. It was not a permanent solution. It held. The cracked window was replaced on day 4 by a man named Phil Garrett, who ran a glass and screen business from his garage and who had gone to school with Harold, and who, upon hearing the situation from Warren, arrived unannounced on a Tuesday morning with the correct pane already cut. Phil charged her $40 for the glass. He refused payment for the labor. He said Harold had once helped him pull a truck out of a ditch at 2 a.m. without being asked, and that $40 and an hour's work did not begin to cover it. Margaret wrote the $40 in the margin of the grocery receipt she was using as her working ledger. The cabin was taking shape. Anyone watching from the outside, and people were watching because Harlan was a town the size of a watching, could see it. A new woodpile appeared along the south wall. A hand-lettered sign went up on the fire road marking the turnoff because Judith Crail had advised establishing visible occupancy markers as part of the title claim. The porch boards were re-nailed over the course of a single afternoon by Margaret and Warren and a teenager named Cooper, who was Warren's nephew and who had been told only that he was helping an old lady with her porch, and who by the end of the afternoon had been told the whole story and was deeply, wordlessly outraged in the way that only 19-year-olds can be outraged, with their whole body and no filter. Cooper came back the next Saturday without being asked. And the Saturday after that, on the morning of February 3rd, 20 days after Margaret had walked out of the house on Clement Road, a certified letter arrived at Judith Crail's office on Merchant Street. It was from the law offices of Garrett, Holloway, and Pierce in Harrisburg, Daniel and Renee's attorney. The letter was 4 pages long. It alleged that the 1958 deed was of questionable authenticity, that the property had been maintained and tax assessed as part of the Voorhees marital estate for decades, that Margaret's occupancy of the cabin constituted trespass pending resolution of the estate matter, and that if Margaret did not vacate the property within 14 days, the firm would seek a court order compelling removal. It also alleged, in language designed to read as clinical, but carrying a very specific sting that Margaret Elaine Voorhees was exhibiting signs of cognitive decline that called into question her capacity to manage legal and financial matters independently, and that Daniel Voorhees, as her son and nearest living relative, had an obligation and a right to act in her best interests. Dove called Judith at 7:45 that morning. Judith read the letter at 8. She called Margaret at 8:15. Margaret was on her morning property walk. She listened to Judith read the letter aloud over Warren's telephone. She stood at the eastern edge of her 4.2 acres in Ruth Pruitt's Boots with a light snow falling, and she listened to every word. When Judith finished, Margaret was quiet for 4 seconds. Then she said, "Judith, what do we need?" Judith said 2 things. First, a cognitive evaluation from a licensed physician, completed and certified, which we can submit as evidence. Second, we need to move faster on the title claim. I want to be in front of the probate judge before Garrett Holloway files anything else. Margaret said, "When can you get the hearing?" Judith said she was already dialing. The cognitive evaluation was scheduled for February 5th with Dr. Patricia Osai at Carlisle Medical Associates. Margaret drove herself to the appointment in a 1998 Subaru Outback that Warren had quietly transferred into her name the previous week. It had been sitting in his lot since Ruth stopped driving, and he had done the paperwork with the same matter-of-fact efficiency with which he did everything that mattered. Dr. Osei administered the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, the Ray Auditory Verbal Learning Test, and a standard orientation evaluation. She also, because she was thorough, asked Margaret to describe the events of the past 3 weeks in chronological order. Margaret did so, in sequence. Without notes, Dr. Osei wrote in her clinical notes, "Patient demonstrates exceptional recall, clear sequential reasoning, and organizational capacity markedly above age group norms. No indicators of cognitive impairment of any kind. Assessment score, 2930. The one missed point was a drawing exercise. Margaret's cube was slightly lopsided. She had never been good at drawing cubes. Harold used to tease her about it. On February 11th, Judith Crail received a call from the Harlan County Probate Court clerk. The title claim had been filed and reviewed. The 1958 deed had been verified against the original recording in Book 14, page 223 of the Harlan County Recorder of Deeds. The deed was authentic, uncontested in any prior proceeding, and legally valid. But that was not the call. The call was about something Dove had found on day 3 of his research and had flagged to Judith in a memo she had read 4 times since, because each time she read it, she found something new to appreciate about it. When Daniel and Renee's attorney submitted the estate asset declaration to probate court the previous month, he had listed the cabin as marital property and assigned it a value of negligible, effectively 0, in order to remove it from the asset calculation and simplify the estate transfer. Standard practice for a worthless property. Efficient. Clean. Except that in listing it at all, even incorrectly, the attorney had triggered a mandatory county review of all listed assets against recorded title history. It was an automated process, a clerical function, the kind of thing that happened in the background of every estate proceeding without anyone paying attention to it. The county title examiner had run the review on January 29th. She had found the 1958 deed. She had flagged the declaration as containing a material factual error, specifically that the listed asset was not marital property and could not legally be included in the estate proceeding. She had then done her job correctly and thoroughly and had cross-referenced the asset listing against the probate filing and found something additional. The estate asset declaration had listed the property under Harold Voorhees' name as sole prior owner, a statement that was not supported by any recorded title document in the county's history. Because Harold Voorhees had never owned the cabin, he had bought it for someone else. He had always owned it for someone else. The title examiner had filed a discrepancy report with the probate court on February 1st. The probate judge, the Honorable Carol Ames, who had been on the Harlan County bench for 19 years and who had a particular and well-documented dislike for estate filings that wasted her court's time, had reviewed the discrepancy report on February 8th. On February 11th, Judge Ames issued an order. The entire Voorhees estate proceeding was frozen. Not paused, not delayed, frozen, meaning no asset could be sold, transferred, accessed, or modified until the title discrepancy was resolved and the court was satisfied that the asset declaration it had received was accurate and complete. Daniel and Renee could not sell the house on Clement Road, could not access Harold's pension disbursement, which was still in the estate, could not transfer the investment account, could not release the savings, could not execute any element of the plan they had built and executed and believed was already finished. The attorney from Garrett Holloway and Pierce called Daniel that afternoon. The conversation lasted 22 minutes. Daniel called Renee immediately after. That conversation lasted longer. Judith called Margaret with the news at 4:15. Margaret was on the cabin porch with a cup of coffee and a yellow legal pad on which she had been making notes about the back room's dimensions and whether a second sleeping area was structurally feasible. She listened to Judith explain all of it. When Judith finished, Margaret said, "Harold filed that deed in 1958. Judith said, "Yes." Margaret said, "He never told me. He just filed it and waited." Judith said, quietly, 66 years. Margaret looked out at the tree line. The snow was melting off the branches in the afternoon sun, that particular late winter drip that means something is beginning to change. She looked at the 4.2 acres that had been hers since before she was anyone's wife, and she thought about a young man driving to a county recorder's office in 1958 with a deed in his hand and a very specific idea about what love was supposed to look like. She said, "What happens now?" Judith said, "Now we go to court. And we finish this." The hearing before Judge Carol Ames was scheduled for February 28th. Garrett, Holloway, and Pierce requested 3 continuances. Judge Ames granted 0 of them. The firm's challenge to the deed's authenticity required them to prove that the document filed in Book 14, page 223 of the Harlan County Recorder of Deeds was either forged or improperly filed. They hired a document examiner from Philadelphia. The examiner spent a week with the county's original records. His report, submitted to the court on February 24th, concluded that the deed was authentic in all respects: paper composition, typeface wear patterns, ink oxidation, and filing notation, all consistent with 1958 production. He also noted in a section of his report that Judge Ames later described in open court as thorough to the point of redundancy, that the filing notation in the recorder's ledger was in the handwriting of a county clerk named Vera Poole, who had worked in the recorder's office from 1951 to 1974. And whose signature appeared on 847 other documents in the same ledger, all authentic. Garrett, Holloway, and Pierce dropped the authenticity challenge on February 26th. They pivoted to arguing that Harold's decades of tax payments on the cabin, he had paid property taxes as part of the general estate without separating the cabin's assessment, constituted evidence of marital ownership. It was a reasonable argument. It was also, as Judith explained to Margaret on the drive to Carlisle, the legal equivalent of arguing that a man who waters his neighbor's garden has thereby acquired the garden. Judge Ames found it unpersuasive. On the morning of February 28th, in Courtroom 3 of the Harlan County Courthouse, Judge Carol Ames issued her ruling. The 1958 deed was valid. The property at the Fire Road address, cabin in 4.2 acres, was the sole and separate property of Margaret Elaine Voorhees and had been continuously since August 17, 1958. The estate asset declaration filed by Garrett Holloway and Pierce was materially inaccurate and was stricken from the probate record. The estate freeze would remain in place pending a corrected filing. The court was referring the matter of the original declaration to the Pennsylvania Bar Association's disciplinary office for review of the filing attorney's conduct. Daniel and Renee's attorney was facing a bar complaint. The estate was frozen until they filed a corrected declaration that did not include property they had never owned. And Margaret Elaine Voorhees walked out of Courtroom 3 into a February afternoon that was, despite everything, already beginning to smell like spring, carrying the deed in the Ziploc bag in her coat pocket next to Harold's photograph, exactly where they had been since the night she built the fire. Warren was waiting in the Silverado. He had brought coffee in a thermos. He handed her a cup without asking. He started the engine. She said, "Take me home, Warren." He drove her up the Fire Road to the cabin. March came to Harlan County the way it always did, reluctantly, in stages, with false starts and setbacks, and one last hard frost on the 14th that killed the crocuses Warren's wife had planted along the hardware store's front walk 12 years ago, and which Warren replanted every spring without comment. Margaret noticed him doing it one morning from across Gallagher Street. She filed it away in the place she kept things that mattered, but did not need to be said aloud. She had been in the cabin for 7 weeks. It did not look like the same place. The transformation had happened the way real transformations always happen, not in a single dramatic gesture, but in the accumulation of small, specific, unglamorous work done consistently over time. The back wall's moisture damage was fully treated and sealed, covered with a fresh layer of white painted pine planking that Warren had sourced from a mill 30 miles north. The cracked window Phil Garrett had replaced now had proper interior trim, painted the same muted green as the shutters on the house on Clement Road. Margaret had matched the color from memory, mixing 2 cans of exterior latex on the cabin's porch on a Saturday afternoon until it was exactly right. The cot frame now held a proper mattress, a modest but functional innerspring that Cooper and 2 of his friends had carried up the Fire Road on a borrowed flatbed because the Silverado's bed was occupied that day with roofing supplies. The kitchen shelf had been extended into a proper counter with a 2-burner propane stove, a small sink connected to a gravity-fed water tank on the roof, and a row of cabinet doors salvaged from a demolished farmhouse that Cooper had found listed on a county surplus site for $40 total. Margaret had installed the cabinet doors herself with a borrowed drill, working from a YouTube video that Warren had found for her on his phone, and which she had watched twice before beginning. When the last door hung level, she stood back and looked at the row of them. Mismatched woods, mismatched hardware, perfectly hung, and allowed herself exactly 30 seconds of satisfaction before moving on to the next item on the list. The list was always there. The list was what kept the days moving in the right direction. Word had continued to travel through Harlan with its characteristic efficiency. By mid-March, the shape of the story was fully known. The eviction, the blizzard, the deed, the frozen estate, the courtroom ruling, and the town had largely completed the process of forming its opinion. The opinion, with some exceptions, had landed where Margaret had suspected it would, once people had all the relevant information. The relevant information had a way of doing that. The Presbyterian Church's Thursday Prayer Circle, which had initially generated the opinion that Margaret perhaps should have simply signed the documents, had subsequently generated the opinion that they had been working from incomplete facts and that the situation was considerably more serious than originally understood and that something ought to be done. The something took the form of a rotating meal delivery that appeared at the cabin every Tuesday and Thursday evening, organized by a woman named Gloria Stanhope, who had been organizing the town's responses to things that needed responding to for 31 years, and who did so with the brisk efficiency of someone who had never once confused compassion with sentimentality. Margaret accepted the meals because refusing them would have been unkind, and because Gloria Stanhope was not a woman you refused gracefully. She also, within 2 weeks, began sending back empty containers that were not empty, filled with sliced pound cake or a batch of the lemon cookies she made from a recipe her mother had given her in 1967, because receiving without returning was not something she was constitutionally capable of. The cookies became, within a further 2 weeks, a point of significant community discussion. Cooper's mother asked if Margaret had ever considered selling them. Margaret said she had not. Cooper's mother said she should consider it. Margaret wrote it in the margin of the working ledger and moved on. Judith Crail called on March 19th. Daniel and Renee had filed a corrected estate asset declaration. The cabin and its acreage had been removed. The estate freeze had been lifted. Harold's pension disbursement, 31 years of a county school administrator's retirement fund, had been released to the estate for probate distribution. And then Judith said the second thing. Because the cabin had been improperly listed in the original declaration, Margaret's attorney had filed a motion requesting the court examine whether any other assets had been mischaracterized. Judge Ames had agreed that the motion had merit. The examination had found one additional item. Harold Voorhees, in 1987, had opened a small investment account at a regional brokerage, a modest thing, $30 a month for 36 years, reinvested automatically, never touched, never mentioned. He had listed the account's beneficiary as Margaret Elaine Voorhees, sole beneficiary, no contingency. The account had not been included in the original probate filing 3 years ago. It had not been mentioned in Daniel's estate documentation. It had, apparently, been overlooked or not looked for. Its current value was $73,400. Judith read the number clearly and precisely, the way she read everything that required precision. Margaret stood in the cabin doorway with the telephone and looked out at the fire road and the tree line beyond it, where the first real green of the season was beginning to show in the upper branches, that particular yellow green that means the decision has been made and the rest is just time. She said, "Judith, is the account mine?" Judith said, "It has been yours since the day Harold opened it." Margaret spent the rest of that afternoon sitting at the cabin table with the working ledger open in front of her, but she was not writing in it. She was looking at the columns she had made over the past 7 weeks: supplies, labor costs, legal fees, the $40 for the window glass, the $40 for the cabinet doors, and she was calculating something different than she had been calculating before. The cabin had a second room that was currently a storage space. It had 4.2 acres with mature hardwood forest, a fire road with good access, and a southern exposure that got full afternoon light from October through April. It had a fireplace that drew cleanly and a kitchen counter that was modest but functional and cabinet doors that were mismatched and perfectly hung. It had the name Voorhees attached to it in the county records, but that was a name she had earned and intended to keep. She opened a fresh page in the ledger. At the top she wrote, in the careful handwriting that had not changed in 60 years, Harold's Table, initial planning. She began to write columns. The adversary had not gone quiet. This needed to be said clearly, because it would have been easy, from the outside, to believe that the court ruling and the frozen estate and the bar complaint had broken something in Daniel and Renee's capacity to continue. They had not. What had broken was their legal position. Their willingness to apply pressure through other means was still intact. In the last week of March, Renee began telling people, at the dry cleaners, at the school board meeting she attended as a parent representative, at the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association, that Margaret's mental state had deteriorated significantly and that the family was deeply concerned. She said this in the careful language of someone who has been coached, speaking in the register of worry rather than accusation, which is harder to challenge and easier to spread. Dr. Osai's cognitive assessment was a matter of record, and Judith had copies. But a court document and a whisper campaign operate in different environments, and Margaret understood this distinction clearly. She did not address it publicly. She did not issue corrections or call anyone to defend her. She continued her morning property walks. She continued the work. She sent back Gloria Stanhope's containers with cookies inside them. She had understood since the night on the frozen floor with the deed in her hands, that the only argument that would matter in the end was the one she was building with her hands and her ledger, and her consistent, visible, daily refusal to be anything other than exactly who she was. Cooper came on Saturdays. Warren came when there was a reason, and sometimes when there wasn't. Phil Garrett came back in late March to look at the electrical and ended up staying half a day. Gloria Stanhope came once, officially to drop off a casserole, and spent 2 hours walking the property with Margaret, discussing drainage and garden placement with the focused interest of someone who had been waiting her whole life to have this particular conversation. By the 1st of April, the cabin was not finished. It would not be finished for another 6 weeks, but it was clearly, visibly, undeniably becoming something. The town could see it from the fire road. Some of them drove past deliberately, on the way to nowhere in particular, just to look. On April 14th, 3 months to the day after Margaret had walked down the driveway on Clement Road in the dark, Judith Crail filed the application for a bed and breakfast operating license with Harlan County. The property was zoned correctly. The deed was uncontested. The structure met code requirements with the modifications that had been completed. The application was accompanied by a letter from Dr. Patricia Osei, confirming the applicant's full cognitive and physical capacity to operate a business. The license was approved on May 2nd. Margaret was at the cabin table with the working ledger when Judith called with the news. She wrote license approved, May 2 in the column for administrative milestones, capped the pen, and allowed herself 30 seconds. Then she opened a new column, opening day preparation. The ribbon cutting was scheduled for the morning of May 17th. Margaret had not invited Daniel and Renee. She had not needed to. Harlan County had a population of 2,400 people and a single main road running through it, and the opening of Harold's Table had been noted in the Harlan Courier's community calendar 3 weeks prior. which meant that anyone within a reasonable radius who wanted to know about it already did. She had not planned a confrontation. She had not wanted one. What she had planned was a ribbon, a length of gold grosgrain from Gloria Stanhope's sewing box stretched across the front porch posts at 9 a.m, with Warren on one side and Cooper on the other, and Judith Creel standing just behind her left shoulder because Judith had said she would be there, and Judith Creel kept her word. The Harlan Courier had sent their photographer, a 23-year-old named Ben Atchison, who had grown up in the county and who photographed everything with the intensity of someone who understood that small-town photographs outlast the people in them. Gloria Stanhope had organized a small gathering. 30 people, she had estimated. 64 arrived. Margaret stood on the porch of the cabin at 8:55 a.m. in a blue wool dress she had not worn since Harold's retirement dinner in 2001, and which still fit because Margaret Voorhees had always moved too much to allow otherwise. Her hair was set. Her shoes were the good ones. In her right hand, she held the rusted hunting knife from the hook above the fireplace, Harold's knife, the one he had owned since before she knew him. The one he had used for 40 years to open everything from fishing line to birthday packages with the same unhurried efficiency he brought to all practical matters. She had chosen the knife deliberately. Warren had asked the night before whether she wanted proper ribbon scissors. She had said Harold never used scissors when he had a knife. Warren had not argued. At 9:03, a silver sedan slowed on Route 9. Margaret saw it from the porch. She recognized the car. She recognized the way it slowed, not the slowing of someone looking for a parking space, but the slowing of someone confronting something they had not fully believed would exist. The car did not stop. It did not turn onto the fire road. It continued past the cabin at a speed just above idle and through the passenger window, briefly, clearly, in the morning light, Renee's face was visible, turned toward the sign above the porch. The sign Warren had built from reclaimed oak boards, routed and painted in Margaret's handwriting, mounted above the porch at exactly the height Harold would have chosen, Harold's table. Bed and breakfast, est. 2024. Voorhees property since 1958. The car continued down Route 9 without stopping. Margaret watched it go. She turned back to the 64 people on her lawn and the gold ribbon across her porch and Ben Atchison's camera and the rusted knife in her right hand. She cut the ribbon. The small crowd made the sound that small crowds make when something has been a long time coming and has finally completely arrived. The confrontation, if it could be called that, which was generous, came 4 days later. Not at the cabin. At the Harlan County Courthouse in the hallway outside Judge Ames's courtroom, where the corrected estate proceeding had its final administrative hearing. Judith had advised Margaret that her attendance was not required. Margaret had attended anyway because she believed in finishing things in the places where they had been decided. Daniel was in the hallway with his attorney, not the one from Garrett, Holloway and Pierce, who had withdrawn from the case in March following the bar referral, but a newer, quieter man from a Harrisburg firm who had the careful expression of someone who had been fully briefed and had decided that careful was the right register for this particular situation. Renee was not present. Daniel saw his mother in the hallway. He stopped walking. Margaret stopped also. They stood 8 feet apart in the corridor outside courtroom 3, the same courtroom where Judge Ames had ruled 4 months prior, where the deed had been validated and the declaration stricken and the bar complaint filed. And they looked at each other with the accumulated weight of everything that had happened between January 14th and this morning pressing on the air between them. Daniel's attorney took 2 careful steps sideways and became very interested in his phone. Daniel said, "Mom, just the one word. The way people say a word when they do not know what comes after it." Margaret looked at her son. She looked at him the way she had looked at every serious thing in her life, directly, fully, without the comfort of looking slightly past it. She said, "Your father put that land in my name before we were married. He never told me. He just made sure. That was who he was." Daniel said nothing. His jaw moved once. She said, "I know you believed you were doing something practical. I know Renee believed it was sensible. I am not going to stand here and tell you what it felt like to walk down that driveway. You know what it felt like. You watched from the window. The hallway was quiet. Somewhere behind the courtroom door, a clerk was moving papers." Margaret said, "I am not going to ask you for an apology. An apology would be for me, and I have discovered that I don't need one. What I am going to tell you is this. Your father built something on that mountain. He built it with his hands, and he put it in my name, and he never once asked for credit for it. I have been thinking about that for 4 months. I think you should think about it too." She picked up her handbag from the bench beside her. She said, "The hearing is at 10. I'll see you inside." She walked past him into the courtroom. She did not look back. She did not need to. The hearing lasted 22 minutes. The corrected estate declaration was accepted. The estate was formally closed. Harold Voorhees' pension disbursement and investment account were released in full. The pension to the estate for distribution per the original will. The investment account directly and immediately to Margaret Elaine Voorhees as sole named beneficiary, no contingency, exactly as Harold had written it in 1987. $73,400. Judith shook Margaret's hand on the courthouse steps. She held it a moment longer than a handshake required, which was the only emotional gesture Judith Crail permitted herself in professional settings. Margaret thanked her. She meant it completely. Warren was parked on the street below the courthouse steps, thermos on the console, engine running. Margaret walked down the steps into a May morning that was warm and clear and smelled of the particular combination of cut grass and diesel and old brick that is the smell of a county seat on a Tuesday in spring, a smell so ordinary and so alive that she stopped on the bottom step for just a moment and breathed it in. Then she got in the truck. She said, "Take me home, Warren." He already knew the way. By the end of June, Harold's table had hosted 14 guests. A retired school teacher from Allentown who came for a weekend and stayed 5 nights. 2 sisters from Philadelphia driving the back roads of Pennsylvania for reasons they described as complicated and which Margaret did not press them on. A young couple from Maryland who had found the listing online and who spent most of their stay on the porch with coffee, talking quietly, the way people talk when they are working something out between them. Margaret fed them all at the same table Harold had carried up the fire road in pieces in 1961 and assembled in the main room with wooden pegs because he had not trusted nails for furniture. The table sat 6. It had not moved in 63 years. It would not move now. The second bedroom, the one carved from the back room where the cedar chest had sat for 22 years, was small but complete. A single window faced east. A hand-stitched quilt from Gloria Stanhope's sewing circle covered the bed. On the narrow shelf above the headboard, Margaret had placed three things: a spare candle, a copy of the Farmer's Almanac 1962, not the original, which Judith had placed in archival storage, but a replacement she had found online for $11, and a small framed photograph of Harold at the cabin in what she estimated was 1965, standing on the porch with a fishing rod and the expression of a man who has nowhere else he needs to be. Guests sometimes asked about the photograph. Margaret told them his name. She told them he had built the place. She did not tell them the rest unless they asked, and some of them asked. And when they did, she told it plainly and without theater, the way a thing that is true does not require decoration. The green ledger had been replaced. Not discarded, it sat on the shelf in the kitchen beside the new one, 41 years of a household's financial history in Margaret's unchanged handwriting. The new ledger was the same brand, purchased from Pruitt's Hardware. The columns were the same. The handwriting was the same. The entries were different. Linen service, $44. Breakfast provisions, $67. Propane, $38. Cooper, Saturday labor, $60. Cooper had stopped refusing payment in April after Margaret had explained to him that being paid for work was not charity, but dignity, and that Harold had believed this, and so did she. He had thought about it for a moment and then accepted the $60, and she had not had to explain it again. On the last Saturday of June, Margaret rose at 5:15 as she always did. Coffee on the 2-burner stove. Medication at 6. She stood at the east window while the coffee brewed and watched the light come over the tree line the way it came every morning, gradually, then completely, the way most things that matter arrive. She put on Ruth Pruitt's boots, which she still wore for the property walk because they fit and because some things earn their place by being exactly right for the purpose. She walked the perimeter of the 4.2 acres in the early morning light, on the path her own feet had worn into the ground over the past 5 months, a visible track now, pressed into the grass and pine duff, curving along the tree line and back to the porch. Her path. On her land. At the eastern edge, she stopped, as she often did, where the trees thinned and the ground rose slightly, and on a clear morning you could see the roof of the house on Clement Road, 2 miles down the valley. She looked at it for a moment. Then she turned around and walked back toward the cabin, where the coffee was ready and the first guests of the morning would be stirring soon, and the table Harold had carried up this mountain in pieces 63 years ago was set for breakfast, as it had been every morning since May 17th, in the name of the man who had understood, long before she did, long before any of this, exactly what it meant to give someone something that could not be taken away. She went inside. She closed the door.